Abraham Lincoln was born into poverty on February 12, 1809, in a small log cabin on Sinking Spring Farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky. He was the second child of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. His family came from English roots through his ancestor Samuel Lincoln, who had settled in Massachusetts in the 1600s. On his father's side, his grandfather, also named Abraham Lincoln, moved the family from Virginia to Kentucky, but was killed during a Native American raid. After his death, the Lincoln family remained in Kentucky, living in Hardin County. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, tried to build a stable life through farming and manual trades. He purchased several farms in Kentucky, but due to faulty land titles and legal disputes, he lost much of his land. Seeking more secure property rights, Thomas moved his family to southern Indiana in 1816. There, they settled in a small frontier community called Little Pigeon Creek, surrounded by dense forest. Thomas worked as a farmer, carpenter, and cabinet maker. Despite constant financial difficulties, he managed to secure legal ownership of 80 acres of farmland in Indiana. Both Thomas and Nancy belonged to a separate Baptist church, a religious group known for its simple way of life and opposition to slavery. Life on the frontier was harsh. In 1818, Lincoln's mother, Nancy, died from milk sickness, a common and deadly illness caused by drinking contaminated milk. She left behind her husband, their daughter Sarah, young Abraham, and a relative named Dennis Hanks. The family struggled through the following months until Thomas remarried. In 1819, Thomas married Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children. She quickly brought order and warmth back to the household. Abraham grew close to her and later referred to her with deep affection. She encouraged his interest in reading and supported his quiet, thoughtful nature. Sorrow returned to Lincoln's life in 1828 when his sister Sarah died during childbirth. Abraham, then a teenager, was deeply affected by the loss. Abraham Lincoln received very little formal education. What little schooling he had came from traveling teachers and was brief and irregular. In Kentucky, he attended school for short periods, where he learned to read, although he may not have learned to write at that time. After his family moved to Indiana when he was 7, he continued attending school occasionally, but altogether, he spent less than a year in any classroom by the age of 15. Despite this, he had a strong desire to learn. He read whatever books he could borrow and developed a lifelong habit of self-education. As a teenager, Lincoln's life was dominated by physical labor. His father expected him to help with farm work and also hired him out to neighboring farmers. By custom, the money he earned belonged to his father, not to him. When he grew older, Lincoln took on new kinds of work. He and a small group of young men were hired to move goods by flatboat down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. It was in that city that Lincoln first saw enslaved people being bought and sold in slave markets. The sight disturbed him deeply and left a lasting impression. In 1830, after fears of another outbreak of milk sickness, members of the extended Lincoln family moved west once again, this time to Illinois. They settled in Macon County. By this period, Abraham had grown more distant from his father. He disapproved of his father's lack of interest in education and personal improvement. Their relationship remained strained, and years later, Lincoln chose not to visit or attend his father's funeral when he died. Lincoln's first known attachment was to Anne Rutledge, a young woman he met after moving to New Salem, Illinois. Some historians believe their relationship was romantic, although the evidence is not entirely clear. Anne died in 1835 from typhoid fever. Her death affected Lincoln deeply, and he fell into a period of severe depression. A few years later, Lincoln became acquainted with Mary Owens. In 1836, he informally agreed to marry her if she returned to New Salem. When she did, the two spent time together, but both began to have doubts. Lincoln wrote to her in 1837, saying he would understand if she chose not to continue the relationship. She declined to marry him. In 1839, Lincoln met Mary Todd in Springfield, Illinois. She came from a wealthy and socially prominent Kentucky family. They became engaged in 1840, but Lincoln abruptly ended the engagement in early 1841. After a period of separation, they reconciled and were married on November 4th, 1842. In 1844, they bought a house in Springfield close to his law office. Their marriage was often strained. Mary Todd was known to have sudden tempers and could be verbally and physically aggressive toward her husband at times. Together, they had 4 sons. Their first child, Robert Todd Lincoln, born in 1843, was the only one who survived to adulthood. Edward, called Eddie, was born in 1846 and died in 1850, likely from tuberculosis. Their third son, Willie, was born in 1850 and died in the White House in 1862 after developing a fever. The youngest, Tad, was born in 1853 and died at the age of 18 in 1871. Lincoln was fond of children and was gentle with his own. He and Mary were not strict parents. The deaths of Eddie, and especially Willie, caused deep grief within the family. Lincoln, who already struggled with sadness throughout his life, experienced what many now believe to have been clinical depression. In 1831, after his father moved the family to a new homestead in Coles County, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln chose to live independently. He settled in the small village of New Salem, Illinois, where he stayed for about 6 years. During 1831 and 1832, Lincoln worked as a clerk in a general store. He became known in the community for his physical strength and bravery after defeating the leader of a local group of tough young men known as the Clary's Grove Boys in a wrestling match. In 1832, he announced his candidacy for the Illinois House of Representatives. His campaign was interrupted when he volunteered for service in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War. The men in his company elected him captain, a role that meant a great deal to him, even though he never saw combat. When he returned, he resumed campaigning, speaking in favor of improving navigation on the Sangamon River. Despite his storytelling charm, he lacked money, influence, and recognition, and he lost the election. After the war, Lincoln considered becoming a blacksmith, but instead entered business. Along with William Barry, he purchased a general store in New Salem. The store was licensed to sell alcohol and operated partly as a tavern. However, Barry was unreliable and drank heavily, and Lincoln was too kind to refuse credit to customers. The business accumulated debt and eventually failed. Lincoln sold his share, but was left owing money he later called his national debt, which he repaid over several years. He went on to serve as the postmaster of New Salem, and later as the county surveyor. During this time, Lincoln spent countless hours reading and educating himself. He decided to become a lawyer. Unlike most aspiring lawyers of the time, he did not study under a practicing attorney. Instead, he taught himself the law by borrowing books such as Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England and Chitty's Pleadings from his friend, attorney John Todd Stewart. He later said that he studied with nobody. In his second campaign for the Illinois state legislature in 1834, Abraham Lincoln ran as a member of the Whig Party and was elected, finishing second among 13 candidates vying for 4 seats. He supported the ideas of Henry Clay, the national leader of the Whigs. Like Clay, Lincoln backed the American Colonization Society, which promoted ending slavery gradually and resettling freed African Americans in Liberia. The Whig platform also supported economic development through national banking, protective tariffs, and improvements to transportation such as roads, canals, and railroads. Lincoln went on to serve 4 consecutive terms in the Illinois House of Representatives for Sangamon County. During his time in office, he strongly supported the construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, a major project intended to link the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. He also voted to expand voting rights to include all white men, rather than limiting it to only those who owned property. Lincoln supported the creation of the Illinois State Bank, and he played a leading role in the successful effort to move the state capital from Vandalia to Springfield. On January 27, 1838, Lincoln delivered a speech at the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield. The speech came after the violent death of Elijah Lovejoy, an anti-slavery newspaper editor who had been killed by a mob. Lincoln warned that mob violence and disregard for the law threatened the future of the nation. Without directly naming opponents, he criticized those who encouraged lawlessness, including members of the Democratic Party, and he condemned racial hatred and opposition to abolitionist ideas. Not long after, Lincoln faced personal embarrassment when a dispute with James Shields nearly led to a duel. Lincoln had written anonymous satirical letters making fun of Shields, signing them as Aunt Rebecca. Shields demanded satisfaction, and the 2 men made arrangements to fight. Seconds before the duel was to take place, mutual friends intervened and settled the matter peacefully. Though no blood was shed, the incident left Lincoln deeply embarrassed. In 1843, Abraham Lincoln tried to secure the Whig Party's nomination for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois' 7th District. The nomination went instead to John J. Hardin. Lincoln, however, persuaded the party to adopt a system where candidates would serve only 1 term, which left the door open for him in the next election. In 1846, he received the nomination and won the seat. Lincoln took his place in Congress as the only Whig representative from Illinois. He was assigned to the Committee on Post Office and Post Roads and the Committee on Expenditures in the War Department. In Washington, he briefly supported a proposal alongside Joshua Giddings to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, but the bill was abandoned when it failed to gain support from other Whigs. While in Congress, Lincoln publicly opposed the Mexican-American War. He believed that President James K. Polk had unjustly drawn the nation into conflict and accused him of focusing on military glory to distract from the truth. Lincoln supported the Wilmot Proviso, an attempt to ban slavery in any territory taken from Mexico, though it did not pass. He also challenged Polk by asking him to identify the exact spot where American blood had supposedly been shed on American soil, a challenge that became known as the Spot Resolutions. This move was unpopular with many in his home district, and critics mockingly called him Spotty Lincoln. Lincoln had promised to serve only 1 term, and in 1849 he left Congress as planned. Believing Henry Clay would not win the presidency, he supported Zachary Taylor as the Whig candidate in the 1848 election. After Taylor's victory, Lincoln hoped to be appointed commissioner of the General Land Office, but the position went to someone else. He was instead offered the role of Secretary of the Oregon Territory. Accepting it would have meant leaving Illinois and ending his political career there, so he declined and returned to practicing law in Springfield. Lincoln became a licensed lawyer and moved to Springfield, Illinois, where he began practicing law with John T. Stewart. Later, he formed partnerships with Stephen T. Logan and eventually with William Herndon, who remained his law partner until he left for the presidency. As a lawyer in Springfield, Lincoln handled almost every type of legal case that came to court in frontier Illinois. He worked on lawsuits involving debt, property disputes, criminal defense, and especially transportation cases. This included conflicts between riverboat operators and the growing railroad companies as bridges began to cross major rivers. Lincoln also designed a small invention meant to help boats float over shallow river areas. He received a patent for it, making him the only American president to ever hold a patent, although the invention was never produced commercially. He argued more than 400 cases before the Illinois Supreme Court and took on many clients, including major companies. One of his largest clients was the Illinois Central Railroad, whom he represented in several significant cases. After winning a case for them, the company refused to pay him, and Lincoln successfully sued them to collect his fees. Lincoln's most famous criminal case was the defense of William Duff Armstrong, who had been accused of murder. The prosecution's key witness claimed he saw the crime because the moon was bright enough that night. Lincoln challenged this by using an almanac to show that the moon had been barely visible. The witness's credibility collapsed, and Armstrong was found not guilty. In another murder trial, Lincoln defended a young man named Quinn Harrison, who was accused of stabbing Greek Crafton. A dying remark made by the victim was first dismissed by the judge as unreliable, but Lincoln argued that it was a dying statement and should be allowed in court. The testimony was accepted, and Harrison was acquitted. By the late 1850s, Lincoln was one of the most respected and successful lawyers in Illinois. His work in law helped shape his thinking, sharpened his speaking skills, and prepared him for his return to national politics. The Compromise of 1850 had attempted to ease tensions between free and slave states, but it failed to provide a lasting solution. The issue resurfaced when Senator Stephen A. Douglas introduced legislation to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories. His proposal used the idea of popular sovereignty, allowing settlers in each territory to vote on whether slavery would be permitted. This Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the long-standing Missouri Compromise, which had previously restricted slavery in parts of the Western territories. Many in the North were outraged, believing the act opened the door for slavery to expand into areas where it had been banned. Abraham Lincoln, who had stepped away from politics, was deeply disturbed by this development. In 1854, he returned to public life and delivered a powerful speech in Peoria, Illinois, arguing that slavery should not be allowed to spread into new territories. This marked the beginning of his active opposition to the act and his renewed involvement in national politics. The act also fractured the Whig Party, which had already been weakened by internal divisions over slavery. Many anti-slavery Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats joined together to form a new political party, the Republican Party. Its central purpose was to stop the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Lincoln was cautious at first about joining the new party. He hoped the Whigs might recover, but as it became clear the party was collapsing, he aligned himself with the Republicans. In 1854, he was elected to the Illinois state legislature, but soon resigned so he could run for the U.S. Senate. At that time, senators were chosen by state legislatures, not by popular vote. Lincoln gained early support in the voting, but failed to secure a majority. Rather than split the anti-slavery vote, he instructed his supporters to back Lyman Trumbull, an anti-slavery Democrat. Trumbull was elected, and Lincoln earned respect for putting the anti-slavery cause above his own ambition. Violence over slavery in Kansas continued, and opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act stayed strong across the North. As the 1856 elections drew near, Abraham Lincoln formally aligned himself with the Republican Party. He attended the Bloomington Convention, where the Illinois Republican Party was founded. The party's platform supported the idea that Congress had the authority to regulate slavery in the territories and called for Kansas to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Lincoln delivered the final speech at the convention, emphasizing the need to preserve the Union. At the National Republican Convention in June 1856, Lincoln received some support for the vice presidential nomination, but the party ultimately chose John C. Fremont for president and William Dayton for vice president. Lincoln supported the Republican ticket throughout Illinois during the campaign. The Democratic Party nominated James Buchanan, while the Know-Nothing Party nominated former President Millard Fillmore. Buchanan won the presidential election. However, Republican candidate William Henry Bissell was elected governor of Illinois. Through his work in the campaign, Lincoln became recognized as a leading Republican figure in the state. Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose owner brought him from a slave state into a territory where slavery was prohibited under the Missouri Compromise. After returning to the slave state, Scott went to a federal court to claim his freedom, arguing that living in free territory had made him free. His case reached the Supreme Court, and in 1857, the court ruled against him in the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it restricted the property rights of slaveholders by preventing them from taking enslaved people into federal territories. The ruling also stated that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be considered citizens and therefore had no right to bring cases to federal court. Many Democrats believed this decision would settle the slavery issue, but it caused anger and resistance in the North. Abraham Lincoln strongly opposed the ruling. He argued that it supported the interests of slaveholders and went against the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which claimed that all people are born with basic rights. In 1858, Senator Stephen Douglas was seeking re-election, and Abraham Lincoln saw an opportunity to challenge him. Many Republicans in Illinois believed it was time for a former Whig to run, and Lincoln's loyalty to the party and his past campaigning had earned him their trust. At the party's first formal convention to select a Senate candidate, Lincoln was chosen with little opposition. He accepted the nomination with determination and delivered a powerful speech warning that the United States could not survive permanently divided between slave states and free states. His message made it clear that the nation would eventually have to become entirely one or the other. The Senate race quickly became one of the most closely followed political contests in the country. Lincoln and Douglas held 7 public debates across Illinois. Crowds of thousands attended, and newspapers nationwide reported every detail. Lincoln argued that the spread of slavery threatened the core values of the Republic and that it conflicted with the principles set out by the Founding Fathers. Douglas defended his belief in popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers in each territory should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Although Republican candidates won more overall votes in Illinois, the Democrats won more seats in the state legislature, which was responsible for choosing senators. As a result, Douglas was re-elected. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but gained something far more important: a national reputation. His speeches and moral clarity made him a known figure across the country, and newspapers began to mention him as a possible candidate for president. In early 1860, Lincoln privately said he would accept a presidential nomination if it came to him. That same year, he was invited to speak at Cooper Union in New York City. There, he argued calmly but forcefully that the nation's founders had intended for slavery to be contained, not expanded. He presented his ideas with logic and historical evidence, which impressed many influential Republicans in the East. The speech established Lincoln as a serious national leader and positioned him as a strong contender for the presidency. In early May 1860, Republicans in Illinois gathered for their state convention in Decatur. Lincoln's supporters presented him as the rail candidate, highlighting his image as a self-made man who had once worked splitting fence rails on the frontier. This symbol of humble origins and hard work made him popular among ordinary voters. A few days later, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln won his party's nomination for president on the third ballot. To balance the ticket politically and geographically, the party chose Hannibal Hamlin of Maine as the vice presidential candidate. At the time, Lincoln still believed civil war was unlikely, and many of his supporters dismissed Southern threats to leave the Union if he were elected. But the Democratic Party had split in two. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, while Southern Democrats chose John C. Breckinridge. A third group, the Constitutional Union Party, made up mostly of former Whigs and moderates, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. The election would become a four-way contest. In the North, Lincoln and Douglas were the main contenders, while Bell and Breckinridge focused on winning support in the South. A Republican youth movement called the Wide Awakes organized rallies, parades, and torchlight processions, generating enormous enthusiasm in the northern states. Many Northerners believed the South would never vote for Lincoln, so they rallied even harder to secure his victory. Unlike his rivals, Lincoln did not travel or give speeches during the campaign. Instead, he stayed in Illinois and relied on his party to spread his message. Republican speakers across the North used his story of rising from poverty to success as proof of the free labor system, where a person could succeed through effort and ability rather than inherited privilege. As interest in him grew, Lincoln set up an office in the state capitol to manage visitors and correspondence, and he hired John George Nicolay as his personal secretary. The election was held in early November. Lincoln won, becoming the first Republican president. His victory came entirely from northern and western states. He was not even on the ballot in most southern slave states. He earned just under 40% of the popular vote in a four-candidate race, but won a clear majority in the Electoral College, carrying every free northern state except one, along with California and Oregon. After Lincoln was elected president, Southern secessionists moved quickly to separate from the Union before he could take office. South Carolina was the first state to secede in December, and by early the following year, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. 6 of these states formed a new government called the Confederate States of America and chose Jefferson Davis as their provisional president. The border and upper southern states, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Arkansas, initially chose to remain in the Union. President James Buchanan, along with President-elect Lincoln, refused to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation and declared secession to be illegal. In February, Lincoln left his home in Springfield, Illinois, and delivered a farewell message to the citizens there before beginning his journey to Washington. Attempts were made in Congress to resolve the crisis with compromise. One of the most prominent proposals was the Crittenden Compromise, which would have allowed slavery to expand into certain territories. Lincoln and the Republican Party rejected it because it conflicted with their stance against the spread of slavery. However, Lincoln supported another measure called the Corwin Amendment, which was designed to protect slavery in states where it already existed. It passed in Congress and was sent to the states for ratification, but secession overtook the process before it could be fully adopted. In late February, Lincoln traveled by train to Washington, but concerns over possible assassination attempts forced him to alter his route and travel quietly through Baltimore. He wore a soft hat and an overcoat that concealed his height, which led some newspapers to mock him for supposedly sneaking into the Capitol in disguise. Washington was heavily guarded when he arrived. On his inauguration day in early March, Lincoln delivered his first address as president. He assured the Southern states that he did not intend to interfere with slavery where it already existed, and emphasized that the Union was perpetual and must be preserved. He appealed to the South to remain in the Union and avoid war. Despite these efforts, the failure of a peace conference held around the same time signaled that compromise was unlikely. When forming his cabinet, Lincoln selected individuals he considered to be the most capable, even if they had been his rivals for the presidency. His main objective was to unify the Republican Party and ensure that the administration included its strongest and most influential figures. This group, often described as a team of rivals, included men with differing views and strong personalities. Lincoln appointed William H. Seward, his principal opponent for the Republican nomination, as Secretary of State. During his presidency, Lincoln also made 5 appointments to the United States Supreme Court. After the death of Justice John McLean in 1861, he appointed Noah Haynes Swain, a corporate lawyer from Ohio who strongly opposed slavery. He then selected Samuel Freeman Miller of Iowa, an outspoken abolitionist whose nomination was widely supported by political leaders from his state, to replace Justice Peter Five Daniel. David Davis, Lincoln's close ally, campaign manager during the 1860 election, and an Illinois judge, was also appointed to the court. To provide political and regional balance, Lincoln chose Stephen Johnson Field, a Democrat and former California Supreme Court justice. Finally, after the death of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, Lincoln appointed Salmon P. Chase, his former Secretary of the Treasury, as Chief Justice, believing Chase would support Reconstruction legislation and help foster unity within the Republican Party. In early April 1861, Major Robert Anderson, commanding Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, reported that his garrison was nearly out of food. After considerable discussion within his cabinet, Lincoln decided to send a relief expedition carrying provisions. He knew this decision might provoke a military response from the Confederacy, but remained committed to resupplying the fort without initiating hostilities. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment continued through April 13th, forcing Anderson to surrender. The attack marked the beginning of armed conflict between the Union and the Confederacy. The fall of Fort Sumter united public opinion in the North in favor of military action to preserve the Union. On April 15th, Lincoln called for 75,000 state militiamen to suppress the rebellion, recover federal property, and defend Washington, D.C. This action required each state to declare its loyalty. As a result, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas seceded and joined the Confederacy. As Union troops moved south to defend the capital, violent resistance occurred in Baltimore on April 19th. Mobs attacked Union soldiers traveling through the city, attempting to block rail connections to Washington. In response, bridges were destroyed by local groups to slow troop movement. The federal government reacted by arresting Maryland officials suspected of obstructing military operations. To maintain order and protect transportation routes, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in parts of Maryland, allowing the military to detain individuals without formal charges. One such detainee, John Merriman, a Maryland militia officer accused of hindering U.S. troop movements, petitioned for release. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, acting in his capacity as a federal circuit judge, issued an opinion in ex parte Merriman, arguing that only Congress, not the President, had the authority to suspend habeas corpus. Lincoln did not comply with Taney's opinion and continued the policy in limited areas. Over the course of the war, approximately 15,000 civilians were detained under these suspensions without trial. Some, including Ohio Democrat Clement L. Vallandigham, were tried in military courts for actions considered disloyal or obstructive to the war effort. These measures were criticized by opponents as violations of civil liberties, but the administration maintained they were necessary to suppress rebellion and protect the Union. As commander-in-chief during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln assumed broad executive authority and shaped overall Union strategy. Faced with an unprecedented military and political crisis, he expanded presidential powers beyond their traditional limits. He authorized a naval blockade of Confederate ports, approved the spending of federal funds without prior congressional approval, suspended the writ of habeas corpus in selective areas, and permitted the arrest and detention of thousands suspected of supporting the Confederacy. Although controversial, these actions received backing from Congress and much of the Northern public. At the same time, Lincoln had to maintain Union loyalty in the border slave states and prevent foreign nations from becoming involved in the war. Political unity was essential, but compromises often risked alienating key factions. Anti-war Democrats, known as Copperheads, opposed Lincoln for refusing to negotiate over slavery, while radical Republicans criticized him for not moving fast enough to end it. On August 6, 1861, Lincoln signed the Confiscation Act, allowing the federal government to seize and free enslaved people used by the Confederacy. The law had limited immediate effect, but showed increasing federal willingness to challenge slavery. Lincoln's military goals were twofold: to defend Washington, D.C., and to wage an active campaign aimed at a decisive victory. He met with his cabinet twice a week and worked long hours, sometimes persuaded by his wife, Mary, to take brief breaks. In choosing generals, especially early in the war, he often selected individuals with political influence or ethnic support to broaden national participation in the war effort. In January 1862, after allegations of corruption in the War Department, Lincoln replaced Secretary of War Simon Cameron with Edwin M. Stanton. Stanton became one of Lincoln's closest wartime associates, and together they managed much of the Union's military administration. Lincoln recognized the strategic importance of controlling the Mississippi River and understood that defeating Confederate armies was more critical than capturing territory alone. He continued to rely on advice from General Winfield Scott, who had drawn up the early Anaconda Plan, which called for blockading southern ports and advancing down the Mississippi to divide the Confederacy. Lincoln met with Scott in June 1862 at West Point to discuss the progress of the war. Diplomatically, Lincoln's main concern was to prevent European powers, especially Britain and France, from recognizing or aiding the Confederacy. He worked closely with Secretary of State William H. Seward and Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Charles Sumner. In late 1861, U.S. naval forces intercepted the British mail ship RMS Trent and captured 2 Confederate envoys on board. The incident sparked serious tensions with Britain. To defuse the situation and avoid a wider conflict, Lincoln ordered the release of the captured envoys. After the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run and the retirement of General Winfield Scott, Abraham Lincoln appointed George B. McClellan as General-in-Chief. McClellan focused first on building strong defenses for Washington, D.C., constructing 48 forts and batteries, armed with 480 cannon, and staffed by about 7,200 artillerymen. He also began planning the Virginia Peninsula Campaign, hoping to capture Richmond by approaching it from the southeast. However, McClellan's slow movements and caution frustrated Lincoln. McClellan, in return, blamed the administration for withholding troops to protect the capital, which he believed contributed to the failure of the campaign. In 1862, Lincoln removed McClellan as General-in-Chief and appointed Henry Halleck to the position. He then placed John Pope in charge of the newly formed Army of Virginia. Pope's campaign ended in defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run during the summer of 1862, and he withdrew to Washington. The Army of Virginia was soon dissolved. Although Lincoln was disappointed with McClellan's failure to support Pope, he briefly restored McClellan to command of the forces defending Washington, including the Army of the Potomac and the remnants of Pope's army. Soon afterward, Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army crossed into Maryland, leading to the Battle of Antietam. The battle ended in a Union victory and became one of the bloodiest single days in American military history. A command crisis followed when McClellan refused Lincoln's request to pursue Lee's retreating army. At the same time, in the Western Theater, General Don Carlos Buell ignored orders to advance the Army of the Ohio into eastern Tennessee. Lincoln replaced Buell with William Rosecrans and removed McClellan from command, appointing Ambrose Burnside to lead the Army of the Potomac. Biographer David Herbert Donald noted that this change was politically strategic, as Burnside and Rosecrans were not strongly tied to either party, unlike McClellan, who was a Democrat. Burnside launched an attack across the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg in December 1862 against presidential advice. The result was a severe Union defeat, and morale fell sharply. Lincoln then replaced Burnside with Joseph Hooker. Hooker was defeated at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863. He resigned in June and was succeeded by George G. Meade. Meade pursued Lee into Pennsylvania and defeated him at the Battle of Gettysburg. However, like McClellan after Antietam, Meade did not stop Lee from retreating back to Virginia, despite Lincoln's urging for a more aggressive pursuit. While this was happening in the Eastern Theater, Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg in July 1863, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River. In May 1863, Lincoln approved the Lieber Code, formerly known as General Orders Number 100. This document outlined rules for the conduct of Union soldiers during wartime, addressing issues such as the treatment of civilians, prisoners of war, and military responsibility for crimes and violations. Two Union generals attempted to issue emancipation orders in 1861 and 1862, but Lincoln revoked both. He believed that emancipation was a decision reserved for the federal government, not the military, and he feared that such actions might push loyal border states to leave the Union. In June 1862, Congress passed legislation prohibiting slavery in all federal territories, which Lincoln approved. The following month, Congress enacted the Confiscation Act of 1862, allowing the federal government to seize enslaved people owned by individuals engaged in rebellion against the United States. On July 22, 1862, Lincoln presented a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. Public reaction to emancipation was sharply divided. Some critics claimed it would damage the nation and the presidency, while others urged Lincoln to move forward more quickly. Lincoln made it clear that his primary duty was to preserve the Union. He stated that any action regarding slavery, whether freeing none, some, or all enslaved people, would be taken only if it helped save the Union. After the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd. The final Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863. It declared enslaved people in the Confederate States still in rebellion to be free. It did not apply to enslaved individuals in the border states or in regions already under Union control. Lincoln believed he was doing the right thing by issuing the proclamation. Across the country, free and enslaved African Americans gathered on the night of December 31st, 1862, later known as Freedom's Eve, to await its implementation. As Union armies advanced into the South, many enslaved people escaped to Union lines, using the proclamation as a pathway to freedom. Reaction to the proclamation varied. Northern Democrats who opposed the war, known as Copperheads, condemned it and called for a negotiated peace that would allow slavery to continue. Some Southern Unionists also viewed it as a violation of earlier assurances that slavery would not be disturbed. The proclamation also made the enlistment of black soldiers official federal policy. Lincoln believed that the participation of black troops would strengthen the Union cause and weaken the Confederacy. He supported their recruitment and argued that their presence in large numbers would hasten the end of the rebellion. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate the new cemetery on the battlefield where thousands had died only months earlier. In a brief speech, he reflected on the founding ideals of the United States and emphasized that the soldiers' sacrifice should ensure the survival of the nation and the continuation of democratic government. The address later became one of the most well-known speeches in American history. After major Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in 1863, and following Admiral David Farragut's earlier capture of New Orleans, Lincoln proclaimed a national Thanksgiving holiday. He chose the last Thursday of November as a day of national gratitude. Lincoln's confidence in General Ulysses S. Grant grew following Grant's successes in battles such as Shiloh and the Vicksburg campaign. Despite criticism of Grant's heavy losses, Lincoln valued his determination and willingness to fight. After the Battle of Gettysburg, General George Meade failed to pursue Robert E. Lee's retreating army. Soon afterward, Grant won a decisive victory at Chattanooga. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to commander of all Union armies. Determined to maintain support for the war effort, Lincoln encouraged unity and perseverance throughout the northern states. the Union increasingly targeted Southern infrastructure, railroads, plantations, and supply routes, to weaken the Confederate war effort. While Lincoln supported these measures, he stressed that the primary goal remained the defeat of Confederate armies, not destruction for its own sake. Grant then launched the Overland Campaign in Virginia, a series of intense battles against Lee's forces. The campaign resulted in extremely heavy casualties on both sides and became the bloodiest sustained fighting in American history. Although Union losses were greater in number, Confederate losses were proportionally higher and harder to replace. By early April 1865, the Confederate government abandoned Richmond, and Lincoln personally visited the captured capital shortly after Union troops entered the city. Amid the war, Lincoln also approved significant domestic measures. On June 30th, 1864, he signed the Yosemite Grant, setting aside land in California's Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of sequoias for public use and preservation. This marked the first time the federal government acted to protect natural land, setting a precedent for future national parks. President Lincoln and his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, faced the immense financial challenge of funding the Civil War. Congress swiftly approved Lincoln's request to raise an army and even increased his proposal of 400,000 soldiers to 500,000. However, both Congress and Chase initially hesitated to raise taxes to cover the growing costs of war. After the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run, the bond market collapsed, and Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1861. This law created the first federal income tax in U.S. history, a flat rate of 3% on annual incomes above $800. Since the average urban worker earned around $600 per year, many Americans were not affected. The act reflected a preference for taxing income rather than property, as more wealth was being held in financial assets like stocks and bonds. Lincoln also signed increases to the Morrill Tariff, originally passed under President Buchanan. These higher import duties were designed to raise government revenue and offset the burden of new taxes on American manufacturers. Throughout the war, Congress debated whether revenue should come mainly from tariffs, favored by rural interests, or from income taxes, which affected wealthier individuals. Over time, support shifted toward income taxation. The 1861 measures did not generate enough revenue. In response, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862, authorizing the issuance of $150 million in paper currency known as greenbacks. Unlike previous currency, greenbacks were not backed by gold or silver, but by government credit. By the end of the war, $450 million had been issued. To further increase revenue, Congress enacted the Revenue Act of 1862, creating excise taxes on a wide range of goods and establishing the first national inheritance tax. It also introduced a progressive income tax system and created the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue to collect taxes. Despite these efforts, wartime expenses continued to exceed income. The federal government issued more greenbacks, borrowed large sums, and saw the national debt rise from $65 million in 1860 to more than $2 billion by 1866. The Revenue Act of 1864 raised income tax rates again, introducing a 5% tax on incomes above $600 and 10% on incomes above $10,000. The threshold for the 10% rate was lowered to $5,000 in 1865. By the end of the war, income taxes provided about 1/5 of federal revenue, though they were intended only as temporary wartime measures. To combat corruption and fraud related to military contracts, Lincoln signed the False Claims Act of 1863, which imposed penalties for fraudulent claims and allowed private citizens to file suits on behalf of the government in an effort to stabilize the national currency and banking system. Lincoln supported the National Banking Act of 1863, which created a network of federally chartered national banks. These banks were required to invest 1/3 of their capital in federal bonds and were allowed to issue national banknotes. After Congress taxed state banknotes in 1865, federal currency became the dominant form of paper money. Several major economic policies not directly related to taxation or banking were also enacted during Lincoln's presidency. The Homestead Act of 1862, which opened millions of acres of western land for purchase at low cost. The Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act of 1862, which provided federal land to fund agricultural and mechanical colleges in each state. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864, which supported construction of the first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869. At the beginning of the Civil War, Russia was the only major world power openly supporting the Union. Other European nations expressed varying degrees of sympathy for the Confederacy. Historian Dean Mahin notes that while Abraham Lincoln had limited experience with diplomatic customs, he still exerted a significant influence on U.S. foreign policy during the conflict. His main aim was to prevent international recognition of the Confederacy. Lincoln appointed diplomats to convince foreign governments to remain neutral. This policy was successful. No foreign nation officially recognized the Confederate States of America, and all major powers maintained formal neutrality throughout the war. Some European leaders saw the conflict as an opportunity to challenge the United States' ability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Spain occupied the Dominican Republic in 1861, and France installed a puppet monarchy in Mexico. At the same time, many Europeans wished for a quick resolution to the war, both to ease humanitarian concerns and to end trade disruptions. Among European aristocrats, there was satisfaction in seeing the United States struggle, which they viewed as proof that democratic government was failing. To counter this perception, Union diplomats focused on arguing that secession was unconstitutional rather than emphasizing slavery. Confederate representatives, meanwhile, avoided discussing slavery and instead promoted their cause as a fight for independence, free trade, and the protection of cotton supplies, which were vital to European economies. The Confederacy expected that European reliance on Southern cotton would force intervention, but this strategy failed. British manufacturers found new cotton sources and continued trade with the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863 did not immediately eliminate the possibility of European involvement, but it shifted public opinion in Europe strongly in favor of the Union by framing the war as a struggle against slavery. After Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863, European leaders increasingly believed that the Confederacy would lose, and any remaining chance of foreign intervention disappeared. Abraham Lincoln appointed William P. Dole as Commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. According to historian Thomas Britton, Lincoln made extensive use of positions within the Indian Service to reward political supporters. His administration largely continued long-standing federal policies toward Native Americans, focusing on assimilation and the reduction of tribal lands. While Lincoln's direct involvement in Native American matters was limited, his administration faced ongoing tension between protecting Western settlers, telegraph lines, and expanding railroads, and managing conflict with native tribes. One of the most significant crises occurred with the Dakota Sioux people in Minnesota. Years of treaty violations, corrupt trading practices, and delayed or missing government payments led to severe hunger among the Dakota. In August 1862, these tensions erupted into the Dakota War. Hundreds of settlers were killed and around 30,000 displaced. Some in the North feared, incorrectly, that this was part of a Confederate plot to unsettle the western frontier. Lincoln initially ordered that paroled Union prisoners of war be redirected to suppress the uprising, but after Confederate objections, he withdrew the order, and no such troops were sent. He created the Department of the Northwest and placed General John Pope in command. Minnesota State Militia Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley ultimately defeated Dakota forces led by Chief Little Crow at the Battle of Wood Lake. After the conflict, a military tribunal conducted trials of captured Dakota warriors. In a process later criticized by legal scholars, including Carol Chomsky, as rushed and unjust, 303 Dakota men were sentenced to death. Lincoln personally reviewed the trial records. He approved executions only for those convicted of killing civilians or committing rape, reducing the number to 39. With one execution delayed, 38 Dakota men were hanged on December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. In 1864, Minnesota Congressman Alexander Ramsey told Lincoln that he would have gained more votes in the state had he allowed all 303 executions. Lincoln replied that he could not hang men for votes. Throughout his presidency, Lincoln spoke of reforming federal Indian policy, but the Civil War and Reconstruction took priority. After his death, changes were made following events such as the Sand Creek Massacre of November 1864, shifting policy toward condemning violence against Native peoples and emphasizing peaceful administration, although major challenges remained. In 1864, President Abraham Lincoln sought re-election during the Civil War. To strengthen national unity and appeal to both Republicans and pro-war Democrats, the Republican Party rebranded itself as the National Union Party for the campaign. Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat from Tennessee, as his vice presidential running mate. During much of 1864, Lincoln's chances of winning seemed uncertain. Heavy Union casualties from General Ulysses S. Grant's campaigns, along with Confederate victories such as the Battle of the Crater, led many Republicans to believe that Lincoln would lose the election. Expecting defeat, Lincoln wrote a private memorandum stating that if he lost, he would still support the president-elect in efforts to preserve the Union until the inauguration. However, Union success on the battlefield shifted public opinion. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864, and victories in the Shenandoah Valley followed in October under General Philip Sheridan. These victories boosted morale in the North and helped secure Lincoln's re-election. He won comfortably in the Electoral College, though the election still took place amid ongoing war. As Union forces continued to weaken Confederate armies, informal discussions about peace began. One significant meeting occurred at the Hampton Roads Conference in February 1865, involving Lincoln, Secretary of State William H. Seward, and Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens. Lincoln insisted that there could be no peace unless the Confederacy agreed to reunion and the end of slavery. No formal agreement was reached except for the exchange of prisoners. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address. Rather than celebrating victory, The speech reflected on the causes of the war and expressed a hope for national reconciliation and healing. It emphasized continuing the work to restore the Union and care for those affected by the conflict. A month later, on April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively ending the Civil War. This surrender led to a chain of further Confederate capitulations in the following weeks. General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered in North Carolina. Confederate forces in Alabama, the Carolinas, and the Trans-Mississippi region also surrendered. The final Confederate military vessel, the CSS Shenandoah, surrendered in November 1865. The Union had prevailed, but the nation now faced the difficult task of rebuilding and determining how to reintegrate the Southern states. Even before the Civil War ended, Lincoln and his administration began planning how to restore the Union and address the future of the South and millions of newly freed slaves. His approach to Reconstruction was based on reconciliation rather than punishment. When asked how former Confederates should be treated, Lincoln reportedly answered that they should be let up easy, reflecting his desire for a peaceful reunification rather than retribution. On December 8, 1863, Lincoln issued his Amnesty Proclamation, offering pardons to most Confederates who would swear loyalty to the Union, except for high-ranking officials and those who had mistreated prisoners of war. Once 10% of a state's 1860 voters took the loyalty oath and accepted emancipation, they could form a new state government. This approach, known as the 10% Plan, aimed for quick restoration of Southern states. Lincoln's moderate strategy, however, faced strong opposition from radical Republicans such as Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and Benjamin Wade, who demanded harsher terms for the South and full political equality for freed slaves. In 1864, Congress passed the Wade-Davis Bill, which required a majority of Southern white men to swear loyalty and imposed stricter conditions for readmission. Lincoln chose a pocket veto, allowing the bill to expire without signing it, which angered the radicals. As Union forces occupied parts of the South, Lincoln appointed temporary governors to rebuild loyal governments, Andrew Johnson in Tennessee and Frederick Steele in Arkansas. In Louisiana, he supported efforts to form a government once 10% of voters took the oath and abolished slavery, but Congress refused to recognize these early governments. After issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which freed slaves only in rebelling states, Lincoln pushed for a permanent, nationwide end to slavery through a constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment was introduced in Congress in 1864. It passed the Senate on April 8, 1864, but initially failed in the House of Representatives. Lincoln made its passage part of his 1864 re-election platform. After his election victory, he renewed pressure on Congress. The amendment passed the House on January 31, 1865. By December 1865, 3/4 of the states had ratified it, and slavery was officially abolished in the United States. Lincoln supported limited federal efforts to assist former slaves. He signed the bill establishing the Freedmen's Bureau, a temporary agency tasked with providing food, shelter, legal assistance, and employment support for formerly enslaved people and displaced Southerners. The Bureau also allowed freedmen to lease confiscated or abandoned land, with the option to buy it after 3 years. While this aid marked progress, Lincoln did not support large-scale land redistribution, such as granting 40 acres and a mule, which many freed people expected. Historians like Eric Foner argue that Lincoln did not envision Reconstruction as a sweeping social revolution, but believed freedom should be guaranteed within limits of property rights and existing systems. Others, like Philip Paludin, suggest Lincoln was beginning to consider stronger protections for black civil rights near the end of his life, including limited voting rights for educated black men and military veterans. John Wilkes Booth, a prominent stage actor and Confederate sympathizer from Maryland, strongly opposed Lincoln's views, especially after Lincoln publicly supported limited voting rights for African Americans in a speech on April 11, 1865. Booth, who had ties to the Confederate Secret Service but never officially joined the Army, became determined to kill the president. Originally, Booth planned a coordinated attack to assassinate President Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant on April 14, 1865, believing their deaths would destabilize the Union government. The Lincolns planned to attend the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and Grant was expected to join them. However, Grant canceled at the last moment and traveled to New Jersey. At about 10:15 p.m., Booth slipped into the presidential box at the theater. He approached from behind and fired a single shot from a .44 caliber Derringer pistol into the back of Lincoln's head. Major Henry Rathbone, who was also in the box, tried to stop Booth, but Booth slashed him with a knife and escaped by jumping onto the stage and fleeing the theater on horseback. Lincoln, unconscious and critically wounded, was carried across the street to the Peterson house. He remained in a coma for approximately 9 hours. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died, becoming the first U.S. president to be assassinated. His body was wrapped in an American flag and taken to the White House under military escort. Vice President Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president later that same morning. Booth fled south through Maryland into Virginia. After a 12-day manhunt, Union soldiers cornered him in a tobacco barn on a farm near Port Royal, Virginia. When he refused to surrender, the barn was set on fire, and Booth was shot by Sergeant Boston Corbett. He died a few hours later. From April 19th to 20th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's body lay in state, first in the East Room of the White House, and then beneath the Great Dome of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Thousands of mourners filed past his casket in silence, draped in black and surrounded by flowers and soldiers standing guard. After the Washington ceremonies, Lincoln's body, along with the casket of his young son Willie, who had died in 1862, began a 2-week funeral journey by train back to Lincoln's hometown of Springfield, Illinois. The route was intentionally circuitous, passing through major cities including Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, Albany, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Chicago. At each stop, enormous crowds, often in the tens or hundreds of thousands, gathered for memorial services. Churches tolled their bells, bands played funeral hymns, and entire cities were draped in black mourning cloth. Along the train tracks in rural areas, people gathered in silence, lit bonfires, held candles, sang hymns, or bowed their heads as the train passed in the night. While most of the nation mourned deeply, historians note that those who despised Lincoln, particularly some Confederate sympathizers, did not hide their satisfaction at his death. Lincoln's assassination inspired powerful works of mourning, especially by poet Walt Whitman, who wrote several elegies in his honor, including When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed and O Captain, My Captain, the latter becoming one of the most famous American poems. On May 4th, 1865, Lincoln was laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. He now lies in the Lincoln tomb, alongside his wife Mary and 3 of their 4 sons. Abraham Lincoln reshaped American republicanism by elevating the Declaration of Independence, rather than the Constitution, as the true moral foundation of the nation. He emphasized its core belief that all people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and treated it as the guiding principle for the nation's political philosophy. His interpretation of equality would go on to influence social and political reform movements well into the 20th century. Politically, Lincoln began as a Whig, supporting economic modernization, banks, railroads, tariffs, and infrastructure, while promoting industry and free labor. Although he admired Andrew Jackson's resolve and connection to ordinary citizens, Lincoln blended this with his own belief in law, institutions, and constitutional order. He respected the Founding Fathers and insisted that political disagreements must be settled through law, elections, and majority rule, not secession or violence. Lincoln's death transformed him into a national martyr, especially for those who saw him as a defender of liberty. Throughout the 20th century, historians and scholars consistently ranked him alongside George Washington and Franklin D. Roosevelt as one of the greatest U.S. presidents. Public opinion polls have often placed Lincoln among the most admired presidents, alongside figures like Kennedy and Reagan. Over time, Lincoln's image has been used by many political groups. Progressives and New Deal-era liberals admired him as a friend of the common man and used his legacy to justify social reforms. By the 1970s, conservatives praised his nationalism, constitutionalism, and economic modernization. Even some in the South eventually came to respect his skill and leadership, though others, especially neo-Confederates, continued to criticize him. For many, Lincoln became known as the Great Emancipator. Frederick Douglass, despite criticizing Lincoln during the war, later said Lincoln treated him with dignity and without condescension. However, by the 1960s, some black scholars and activists began challenging this legacy. Writers like Lerone Bennett Jr. argued that Lincoln was reluctant on emancipation, held racist views typical of his time, and at times supported colonization plans to relocate freed slaves outside the U.S. In response, Lincoln's defenders argue that his actions, ending slavery, preserving the Union, passing the 13th Amendment, proved his commitment to human freedom, even if he moved gradually for political and military reasons. Lincoln also became a folk hero, known as Honest Abe, celebrated for his humility, integrity, and storytelling. Scholars like David Herbert Donald described him as a leader able to remain calm amid uncertainty, what he called negative capability. Hollywood has frequently depicted Lincoln in a heroic light, more as a symbol of ideals like justice, equality, and perseverance than as a complex political figure. Globally, leaders such as Karl Marx, Giuseppe Garibaldi, Mahatma Gandhi, Willy Brandt, and Nelson Mandela expressed admiration for Lincoln. Mandela even compared Lincoln's idea of a new birth of freedom to South Africa's transition out of apartheid. Lincoln's life was a reminder that greatness is not born from ease, but from patience, conviction, and quiet courage. He entered history not with armies at his command or fortunes in his name, but with a worn coat, a tired face, and an unshakable belief that a nation divided could still choose to heal. He preserved the Union, ended slavery and law, and reshaped the meaning of freedom in America. Not perfectly, not without hesitation, but with a heart set on justice and a mind anchored to duty. And though he did not live to see the peace he fought for, his words, his humility, and his resolve would outlive the war, the hate, and even the century that followed. Today, his legacy is not only carved into stone monuments or written in history books. It lives in the idea that even in the darkest hours of a nation, a single steady voice can remind millions of who they are and who they still might become. And now, as his story comes to a close, of a boy with borrowed books, of a lawyer walking dusty roads, of a president carrying the weight of a fractured country, we set down the pages. Let the echoes of his words grow quiet and rest. Good night, Mr. Lincoln. Good night to the long road you walked and the nation you helped hold together.